Something happens when you leave this town. The farther away, the hazier it all gets. But me, I never left. I remember all of it. It Chapter 2 is directed by Andy Muschietti and starring Bill Skarsgård, Bill Hader, Jessica Chastain, James McAvoy, Isaiah Mustafa, Jay Ryan, James Ransone, and Andy Bean. Before I go any further, I just want to say there will not be any plot spoilers in this review. This is the sequel, the second part, the second chapter to the movie It that came out a few years ago. This film is set 27 years after the events in that film, and we are once again reunited with the Losers Club, and they all have to return back to Derry because Pennywise has returned. This film is much less of a sequel and more of another chapter, a continuation, something in that regard. And that's why I think this film feels a little bit different when it comes to traditional sequels. I also am really happy that Andy Muschietti has returned once again with, I believe, his entire filmmaking crew from the first film, so these films feel very similar to one another and they kind of flow into one another very seamlessly. So you can kind of watch these films back to back, or I would really love for them to just cut both of these films together and make one long supercut of this movie, which I think they may or may not do. But I really want to commend Andy Muschietti from really pulling this off, because this is not an easy film to pull off, because there are so many variables and so many things that he's dealing with in this movie, and he's coming off all of the hype from the previous film, so that just adds more pressure into it. But I really want to say that one of the positives I can say about this movie is that Andy Muschietti does a fantastic job with the film in general. And I'm saving that for a little caveat when I get to my negatives later, but let's stick with the positives. One, he casted a fantastic cast when it came to aging up all of the characters that we saw in the previous film. You have an outstanding cast. Bill Hader, James McAvoy, Jessica Chastain, all the others that I read off in my intro. But the standouts for me are kind of those three. Jessica Chastain, Bill Hader specifically, and I think James McAvoy does a really good job in this movie. What this film does is that over the course of its runtime, which is a very long runtime, I'll get to that later, is you see these characters slip back into their younger selves that we saw in the first film. A lot of the same kind of mannerisms and things like that tend to resurface. And what is also very interesting about this movie is I think there is a lot of good thematic depth within it. Once again, because it feels more like a continuation, a lot of the themes are very, very similar from the first movie. And that is where we get into kind of a double-edged sword, where we get into kind of both a positive and a negative for me. The themes from the first film are very, very strong. The characters are very, very strong. So that translates well. But the problem is that we're also getting a lot of retreaded themes from the first movie and a lot of retreaded kind of plot from the first movie as well. And that can kind of bother someone if you are looking for a sequel to kind of build off of its predecessor and go into new and more interesting things. This film doesn't quite do that. Muschietti knows exactly how to use the camera. He knows how to edit certain scenes to make them very tenseful and have a lot of suspense to them. And some of the scares are also very good. The problem I have with them is similar to the problems I had with the first film, where a lot of the horror is very much telegraphed to us. We can kind of assume what's going to happen just by the way he sets certain things up. And that can be something that's a problem for some people who are very in tune with that, but if you're not someone who's in tune with that, I think you're going to enjoy the scares, enjoy the frights, and similar to the first film, Pennywise, who's portrayed by Bill Skarsgård, is delivering a lot of the major horror in this movie, and I have to say, Bill Skarsgård is absolutely fantastic in this movie once again. He is frightening, he's darkly comedic, he is really, really good in this role. He really disappears within it, despite all of the, the makeup and the CGI and things like that. The CGI in this movie is quite cumbersome when it comes to his character, but when we just see him in the makeup, he is really, really fantastic. But speaking of Pennywise, once our band of losers get back to Derry, and once things get kind of set up for the main plot of this movie, you get to see Pennywise do a lot of his major work, and he's playing on a lot of the things that we saw from the first film. He's playing on their fears, he's playing on their isolation, he's playing on a lot of those things. But what I really like about this movie is when it comes to counteracting Pennywise and his fear-mongering and feeding off of our fears and things like that, our cast of characters have to band together and feel like a family and have some camaraderie and kind of battle evil with love and with friendship, and that's a very strong and powerful thing in this movie. It's a very beautiful thing, and I really felt that this film delivered on that. Where I felt that this film kind of faltered for me is in doing all of those things. There's a lot of plot issues I have with the movie, some storytelling issues I have with the movie. I won't get into all of that, but I'll just say that this film heavily relies on tying us and getting us back to what the first film was. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, it's very time consuming, and it relies heavily on flashbacks to certain events that happened in the first film, but certain new events that we didn't see in that first film. And that is when some troubles arise for me, because the actors from the first film are very young. The film has to utilize de-aging technology, and for me, as someone who's very astute to these technical things, it looked very obvious, and it really took me out of the film. It really made me feel a sense of loss of authenticity in what I was watching, and also they had to change the characters' voices to kind of match up to the voices in the first film as well, so that also took me out of the film a little bit as well, and it didn't help that they kept going back to these scenes. And the second act of the film is where you get the bulk of the film, and this is a long movie. This movie is 2 hours and 49 minutes with credits, so obviously a little shorter without, but you really feel it at times. The second act of this film really slows down, and there's a lot of plot pacing issues with this movie. Just in the way the plot is set up and the way the plot is drawn out, a lot of scenes go on for way too long. There is one plot element to this movie that centers around a specific character that I won't name that could have literally been taken out of this movie, and you wouldn't have lost anything in the movie at all. You wouldn't have lost the character or the role he plays or any specific themes he's dealing with. It was just in there just to be in there, and there are certain things in this film that are just in here just to be in here, and I felt that the overall editing of the movie suffered because of it, and my overall enjoyment of the film suffered because of it. But once we get into the third act of the film, things tend to pick up again, and the matter at hand becomes more prescient, it becomes more important, it becomes more apparent, and that's kind of the energy I wanted to feel throughout the film. And it's really difficult to make a film of this size, of this magnitude, and to balance a lot of the things that this film balances, which I think it balances very well. We do get a lot of the different characters getting appropriate screen time. Some get more than others. Some get left off screen for way too long, to the point where I kind of forgot what they were doing because the film is so long. But I found myself enjoying this film, and I think if you like the first film, I think you're going to like this movie. If you didn't like the first film, I don't think you're going to like this film. So with all of that being said, I'm going to give this movie a 3.5 out of 5 stars. The casting is great, the acting I think is really solid, the direction from a technical standpoint I think is rather solid, the plot pacing is problematic, also some of the CGI in this film is really overly done and really obvious, and I'm not just talking about the de-aging, I'm talking about for a lot of the scary and more horror effects in this film. The film really would have benefited from a lot more practical effects, but we have what we have. That has been my review of It Chapter 2. If you like this video, please check out the other videos on my channel.